In the early years of World War II, Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable. The Wehrmacht crushed Poland in weeks, France fell in 6 weeks, and the Luftwaffe dominated European skies. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced, or so it seemed. German tanks were technologically superior, their pilots more experienced, their tactics more innovative. Yet by 1945, Germany lay in ruins, its armed forces utterly destroyed. What happened? The answer lies not in any single battle or campaign, but in a war of production, logistics, and replacement that Germany could never win. This is the story of how the Allies replaced losses faster than Germany could count, and in doing so, won World War II through industrial might as much as military skill. At the heart of this story is a simple but devastating truth. Germany was fighting enemies with far greater industrial capacity, larger populations, and access to resources that the Third Reich could only dream of. The United States alone possessed an industrial base that dwarfed Germany's. When America entered the war in December 1941, it was already the world's largest economy, producing more steel, oil, and manufactured goods than any other nation. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, possessed vast reserves of manpower and had relocated much of its industry beyond the reach of German bombers. Britain, though smaller, had the advantage of being an island fortress with access to global resources through its empire and, crucially, American support through Lend-Lease. Germany, by contrast, was resource poor. It lacked sufficient oil, rubber, and many critical metals. Its economy was relatively small compared to the combined Allied powers, and its industry was never fully mobilized for total war until it was too late. Even at the peak of German war production in 1944, the country was being outproduced by a staggering margin. The numbers tell an incredible story. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft. Germany produced 39,807. The Soviet Union added another 40,300. Britain contributed 26,461. That's a combined Allied total of 163,079 aircraft versus Germany's 39,807, more than 4 to 1. And this wasn't a one-year anomaly. Similar ratios held throughout the war. Let's look at tanks. In 1944, the United States produced 17,565 tanks. The Soviet Union produced a staggering 29,000. Britain added 5,000. Germany, despite devoting enormous resources to tank production, managed only 19,000. Again, the Allies outproduced Germany by massive margins. Ships tell the same story. American shipyards alone launched more tonnage in 1943 than the entire Axis produced during the entire war. The famous Liberty ships, built using revolutionary assembly line techniques, could be completed in as little as 42 days. At peak production, American yards were launching 3 ships per day. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping. Yes, but new ships were entering service faster than submarines could send them to the bottom. But production numbers alone don't tell the whole story. What made the Allied system truly devastating was not just the quantity of equipment produced, but the speed with which losses could be replaced and the efficiency of the training systems that produced replacement crews. Consider the case of bomber crews. When a British Lancaster or American B-17 was shot down, its 7 to 10 crew members were usually killed or captured. These were highly trained men pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, gunners, each requiring months of specialized training. Replacing them was a monumental challenge, yet the Allies managed it with remarkable efficiency. The United States established a vast training infrastructure that by 1944 was producing thousands of pilots every month. Training bases spread across America, Canada, and other Allied nations, far from enemy action. Student pilots learned in safe skies using plentiful fuel and abundant aircraft. The RAF operated a similar system through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which used facilities in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and Rhodesia to train pilots away from the combat zones. This meant that when an experienced pilot was lost in combat, there was already a replacement working through the training pipeline. The production of trained aircrew became as industrialized as the production of the aircraft themselves. Germany, by contrast, struggled increasingly with training as the war progressed. As fuel became scarce, training hours were cut. As experienced instructors were needed at the front, training quality declined. By 1944, many German pilots were entering combat with as little as 50 hours of flying time, whereas their Allied counterparts had 300 or more. The result was predictable. Inexperienced German pilots were quickly shot down, leading to even greater losses that couldn't be replaced. It became a death spiral. The Luftwaffe lost 2,262 pilots in the first 6 months of 1944 alone. There was no way to replace such losses with properly trained men. The same pattern played out with tank crews, naval personnel, and infantry. The Allies could absorb horrific casualties and rebuild their forces. Germany could not. Take the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1,942 losses that would have knocked any other nation out of the war. Millions of soldiers were killed, captured, or wounded. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed, yet the Red Army kept coming. Why? Because behind the front lines, Soviet factories were producing replacements at an astonishing rate, and the Soviet training system, though brutal and often inadequate by Western standards, was pumping out replacement soldiers in vast numbers. Soviet industrial mobilization was one of the great achievements of the war. When Germany invaded in 1941, Stalin ordered the wholesale relocation of industry eastward, beyond the range of German aircraft. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Within months, these factories were back in production. The city of Tankograd, built around evacuated tank factories in Chelyabinsk, became the largest tank production center in the world. At its peak, Tankograd alone was producing 18,000 tanks per year. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored in brutal conditions, sometimes in unheated buildings during Siberian winters to keep production going. The T-34 tank, which proved to be one of the best tanks of the war, was deliberately designed for mass production. It was simple, rugged, and could be manufactured quickly by semi-skilled workers. Its sloped armor was effective yet required less steel than German designs. Its diesel engine was reliable and used less precious fuel than gasoline engines. Most importantly, it could be built in enormous numbers. By war's end, the Soviet Union had produced over 84,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany, despite having the superior Tiger and Panther tanks, produced only about 25,000 tanks in total. Quality matters in war, but in a conflict of attrition, quantity has a quality all its own. American industrial might was even more overwhelming. The United States entered the war with enormous advantages: vast natural resources, a huge and skilled workforce, and the world's most advanced industrial infrastructure. More importantly, American territory was completely safe from enemy attack. No bombs fell on Detroit's tank plants or Seattle's bomber factories. American industry could operate at full capacity without interruption. President Roosevelt set ambitious production targets that many experts thought impossible. In 1940, he called for 50,000 aircraft per year. Skeptics scoffed. By 1944, American factories were producing that many every 6 months. The American approach to war production was revolutionary. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler converted automobile plants to military production, bringing assembly line techniques perfected in peacetime to the manufacture of tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, became the most impressive example. At peak production, Willow Run was completing one 4-engine bomber every 63 minutes. Workers assembled the aircraft on a moving line, just like automobiles. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. By the end of the war, Willow Run had produced 8,685 B-24s, about half of all the Liberators built. Standardization was key to Allied success. American-built Sherman tanks used interchangeable parts, making field repairs easier. Allied aircraft engines were mass-produced using standardized specifications. Even small arms were designed for mass production. The M1 Garand rifle, the standard American infantry weapon, was built using modern manufacturing techniques that allowed semi-skilled workers to produce large numbers quickly. Germany, by contrast, often favored complex, precision-engineered equipment that was difficult to manufacture and repair. The Tiger tank was formidable in combat but took 300,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman required just 10,000 man-hours. For every Tiger, the Americans could build 30 Shermans. German production methods were often artisanal rather than industrial. Workers hand-fitted parts. Quality control emphasized perfection over speed. This produced excellent equipment. German optical sights, for example, were superior to Allied equivalents, but it couldn't produce enough equipment. Germany also made strategic errors in production priorities. Resources were wasted on wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket, which consumed enormous amounts of materials and skilled labor, but had negligible military impact. The jet-powered Me-262 fighter was revolutionary, but came too late and in too few numbers to matter. Germany produced only about 1,400 of them, and many never saw combat due to fuel shortages and lack of trained pilots. Allied logistics were another crucial advantage. Having all the tanks and aircraft in the world means nothing if you can't get them to the front, supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The Allies built logistical systems of unprecedented scale and efficiency. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces after the Normandy invasion, at its peak involved 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons of supplies per day. American engineers built ports, roads, bridges, and pipelines across Europe. The famous Pluto pipeline under the ocean pumped fuel from England to France beneath the English Channel. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic became a contest between German U-boats trying to sever Britain's supply lines and Allied shipyards trying to build vessels faster than submarines could sink them. In early 1942, Germany appeared to be winning. U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships that year. But American shipyards were gearing up. The introduction of Liberty ships, built using prefabricated sections welded together, revolutionized merchant ship production. 18 American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. The record for fastest construction was held by the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours, though this was a publicity stunt, and normal construction took several weeks. The Allies also built hundreds of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls to provide air cover for convoys. These escort carriers, nicknamed jeep carriers, carried aircraft that could hunt submarines and drive them away from convoys. Combined with improved radar, sonar, depth charges, and code-breaking intelligence from Ultra, the Allies turned the Battle of the Atlantic around. By mid-1943, U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build them. In May 1943 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats. Admiral Dönitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic. The battle wasn't over, but the crisis had passed. Thereafter, new ships joined the Allied merchant fleet faster than U-boats could sink them. The replacement of manpower losses tells a similar story. The Soviet Union mobilized over 34 million people into military service during the war, an almost incomprehensible number. Soviet losses were staggering, at least 10 million military deaths, possibly more. Yet the Red Army continued to grow stronger throughout 1943 and 1944. Fielding ever larger formations with ever greater firepower. How? Through total mobilization of society. Women served in combat roles as pilots, snipers, tank crews, and infantry. Older men and boys were conscripted. Workers were exempted from military service only if their jobs were truly essential. The Soviet training system was brutal and basic, but it produced soldiers in sufficient numbers. The United States mobilized 16 million people into the armed forces from a pre-war population of 130 million. America's training system was the most sophisticated in the world. Specialized schools taught everything from tank maintenance to amphibious warfare. Soldiers trained with live ammunition in realistic conditions. Officers attended command schools. The system produced not just large numbers of soldiers, but well-trained, well-equipped soldiers who arrived at the front, ready to fight. When American divisions suffered heavy casualties, as they did in battles like the Hurtgen Forest or the Battle of the Bulge, replacement soldiers were available within weeks. Entire divisions could be rebuilt while still in the line. Germany's replacement system, by contrast, broke down as the war progressed. In the early years, Germany maintained high-quality training and only sent well-prepared soldiers to the front. But as casualties mounted and manpower became scarce, training was shortened, standards lowered, and increasingly unsuitable men were conscripted. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was enlisting boys of 16 and men in their 50s. The Volkssturm, Germany's home guard, formed in late 1944, consisted of essentially untrained civilians given armbands and obsolete weapons, and told to stop the Red Army. They were massacred. Germany was scraping the bottom of the barrel while the Allies still had vast reserves. Consider the numbers. By 1944, Germany had approximately 13.4 million men in uniform from a total population of about 70 million. This represented almost every fit male between 17 and 50. Germany had mobilized its population about as thoroughly as possible, yet the Allies could field even larger forces while still maintaining war production. The United States had 12 million in uniform, from a population of 130 million, proportionally less mobilization than Germany. Yet America's armed forces were better equipped, better supplied, and backed by an industrial base that Germany couldn't match. The Soviet Union's 11 million in uniform in 1945 represented a rebuilt Red Army that had already suffered and replaced catastrophic losses several times over. The replacement of specialized personnel was particularly crucial. Consider aircraft. Shooting down a bomber meant killing or capturing not just a pilot, but an entire highly trained crew. Yet the Allies developed training pipelines that produced replacement crews faster than combat could consume them. The United States trained 193,440 pilots during the war, plus hundreds of thousands of navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. The RAF trained 125,000 pilots. Even when losses were heavy, Bomber Command sometimes lost 5% of its force on a single raid. Replacements were available. German pilots, by contrast, flew mission after mission with no prospect of rotation home until they were killed or too exhausted to continue. Experienced German aces accumulated hundreds of kills, not because German pilots were inherently superior, but because they flew far more missions than Allied pilots, who were rotated out after a set number of operations. The quality of replacement equipment improved throughout the war for the Allies, even as production increased. The P-51 Mustang fighter, introduced in 1943, was superior to anything Germany had in production. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, was better than the original T-34. Allied naval vessels incorporated the latest radar and fire control systems. American weapons like the proximity fuser shell that exploded automatically when near a target gave Allied forces technological advantages that Germany couldn't match. Meanwhile, German equipment quality often declined as the war progressed. Late-war German tanks were less reliable than earlier models due to material shortages. Aircraft were built with ersatz materials that degraded performance. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were conscripted and replaced by forced laborers. Allied cooperation in production and supply was another advantage Germany lacked. Lend-Lease, the American program to supply Allied nations with equipment and materials, was crucial to both British and Soviet war efforts. The United States sent the Soviet Union 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and vast quantities of food, fuel, and raw materials. These supplies didn't win the war for the Soviets, but they freed up Soviet production to focus on tanks and artillery, while American trucks handled logistics. Lend-Lease to Britain totaled over $31 billion in wartime dollars, roughly $400 billion today. This included everything from aircraft and ships to food and oil. Britain could never have sustained its war effort without American support. The British Commonwealth also pooled resources. Canada became a major producer of trucks, ships, and aircraft. Australian factories produced weapons and ammunition. South African mines provided crucial minerals. India mobilized millions of soldiers and supplied vast quantities of food and raw materials. This global network of production and supply meant that even when Britain's own factories were bombed or resources were scarce, the empire could draw on worldwide resources. Germany and its allies had no equivalent system. Italy was poor and industrially weak. Romania and Hungary were agricultural societies with limited industrial capacity. Japan, Germany's Pacific ally, was geographically isolated and fighting its own war against America. The Axis powers never coordinated their production or shared resources effectively. By 1944, the disparity in production had become absurd. Germany was still producing significant quantities of equipment. 1944 was actually Germany's peak production year for many weapon types. But it was being swamped by Allied output. For every German tank, the Allies produced 4. For every German aircraft, the Allies produced 5. And unlike Germany, which was devoting a huge portion of its production to replacing losses, the Allies were building up overwhelming superiority. D-Day in June 1944 was only possible because the Allies had accumulated such enormous stockpiles of equipment and supplies that they could land and sustain multiple armies in France, while simultaneously fighting in Italy, advancing in the Pacific, and supplying the Soviet Union. The invasion fleet for Normandy included nearly 7,000 vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, and support ships. The Allies landed 156,000 men on D-Day alone, with millions more to follow. Vast artificial harbours called mulberries were towed across the Channel to handle the logistics. Pipelines were laid underwater to pump fuel directly to France. Nothing remotely like this had ever been attempted. It was only possible because of the massive industrial capacity the Allies had built up. Germany could never have mounted such an operation, even at the height of its power in 1940–41. The logistical capacity simply didn't exist. The air war demonstrates the replacement advantage most starkly. The bombing campaign against Germany required the Allies to accept horrific losses. Bomber Command lost 55,000 aircrew killed, and the US 8th Air Force lost thousands more. Yet the bombing continued and intensified because losses could be replaced. New bombers rolled off American and British production lines. New crews graduated from training schools. By 1944, the Allies were flying 1,000 bomber raids regularly. The Luftwaffe, even when it managed to shoot down 50 or 100 bombers in a single raid, a tactical victory, was losing the strategic war, because those bombers were replaced within days, while irreplaceable German pilots and aircraft were being destroyed. German jet aircraft, introduced in late 1944, showed what Germany might have achieved with better planning and resources. The Me-262 was significantly faster than Allied fighters and heavily armed. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was devastating. But Germany produced only about 1,400 of them, and many were destroyed on the ground or lost to accidents and mechanical failures. Allied numerical superiority was so overwhelming that even technological advantages couldn't compensate. Allied fighters and bombers would simply swarm German jets, shooting them down during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. Quality matters, but quantity overwhelms quality when the disparity is great enough. The V-weapons V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets represented another German technological achievement that ultimately meant little because it couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities to matter. Germany launched about 10,000 V-1 Sir and 3,000 V-2 Sir against Britain and other targets. These caused civilian casualties and damage, but had no significant military impact. Each V-2 cost as much to produce as a fighter aircraft, and carried a much smaller payload. The resources devoted to V-weapon production would have been far more effective if spent on conventional aircraft or tanks. But Hitler was obsessed with wonder weapons and retaliation, so resources were wasted on weapons that couldn't change the war's outcome. By 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied material superiority. German cities were being systematically destroyed by bombing. Transportation networks were wrecked. Oil production had been crippled by attacks on synthetic fuel plants. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. Tanks couldn't move. Even when Germany managed to assemble forces for counterattacks like the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, they could achieve only temporary success before running out of fuel and ammunition. German soldiers fought with courage and skill, but they were overwhelmed by enemies who had more of everything: more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, more ammunition, more fuel, more food, more replacements. The Eastern Front in 1944–45 saw Soviet superiority reach astronomical levels. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, involved 2.3 million Soviet troops, 5,200 tanks, and 5,300 aircraft attacking Army Group Center. The Germans were outnumbered 3-1 in men, 6-1 in tanks, and 14-1 in aircraft. No amount of tactical skill could overcome such disparities. Army Group Center was annihilated, losing 400,000 men, one of Germany's worst defeats of the war. The Soviets could afford such massive offensives because their production and replacement systems could sustain them. Germany could not match these losses and continue fighting. The final battles of 1945 were utterly one-sided. During the Battle of Berlin, the Soviets assembled 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. Germany defended with perhaps 800,000 troops, many of them poorly trained Volkssturm militia, and a few hundred tanks, many immobilized for lack of fuel. Soviet artillery fired 1.8 million shells in the preliminary bombardment, alone more than the entire German ammunition reserve. The outcome was never in doubt. Germany's situation was hopeless. The Allies had replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them, built up overwhelming force, and now applied it with crushing effect. The numbers from the entire war tell the story. Germany produced approximately 190,000 aircraft during the war. The Allies produced over 633,000, more than 3 times as many. Germany produced about 67,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Allies produced over 227,000. Germany built 1,100 U-boats and major warships. The Allies built tens of thousands of vessels, including hundreds of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. In virtually every category of military equipment, the Allies outproduced Germany by enormous margins, and this production continued to increase throughout the war, while German production, despite heroic efforts, could never keep pace. The human cost was staggering on all sides, but the replacement advantage meant the Allies could sustain losses that would have destroyed Germany. The Soviet Union lost at least 27 million people, military and civilian, an almost incomprehensible tragedy. Yet the Soviet Union kept fighting, kept producing, kept replacing losses, and ultimately won. Germany lost perhaps 7 million people, a smaller absolute number, but from a much smaller population. By 1945, Germany had no more reserves. Every man who could hold a rifle was already in uniform or dead. The Allies, by contrast, still had vast reserves of manpower and were stronger in 1945 than they had been in 1944. The Allied victory was not inevitable in 1939 or even 1941. Germany had opportunities to win or at least avoid total defeat. But once the war became a contest of production and attrition, Germany's fate was sealed. The Third Reich simply could not match the industrial might of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union combined. Germany's strategic position was hopeless once it failed to knock the Soviet Union out quickly, and once the United States entered the war, From that point, it was only a matter of time before Allied production and replacement capabilities ground Germany down. The legacy of this production war shaped the post-war world. The United States emerged as a superpower in part because of its demonstrated industrial capacity. The Soviet Union, despite devastating losses, became a superpower because it had proved it could mobilize total war production. The lessons learned about mass production, logistics, and industrial organization were applied to peacetime economies, contributing to post-war prosperity. Modern military planning still emphasizes logistics, supply chains, and replacement capabilities lessons learned from World War II. Germany's defeat demonstrated that wars between industrial powers would be won or lost based on production capacity as much as battlefield tactics. Individual stories illustrate the massive scale of replacement. Consider a single American bomber group, the 303rd Bomb Group, which flew B-17 Sail from England. The group was credited with shooting down 377 German aircraft, but it also lost 210 of its own bombers more aircraft than it had at any one time. Yet the group continued operations throughout the war because replacement aircraft and crews arrived regularly. This pattern repeated across dozens of bomb groups. The 8th Air Force lost 4,754 bombers destroyed, 4,000 more damaged beyond repair, and suffered 46,000 casualties among aircrew. Yet its strength increased throughout 1943 to 44 as replacements exceeded losses. On the ground, American armored divisions routinely lost 50% or more of their tanks in major battles, yet continued fighting because replacement tanks were available. The 2nd Armored Division landed in Normandy with 232 Sherman tanks. By the time it reached Germany, it had lost over 800 tanks, more than 3 times its original strength, but remained an effective fighting force because replacements kept arriving. German panzer divisions, once destroyed, often could not be rebuilt. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, was nearly annihilated in Normandy in summer 1944, and never fully recovered despite receiving some replacements. The Soviet replacement system was even more ruthless in its efficiency. Entire Soviet armies were destroyed in 1941 to 42, yet new armies were formed bearing the same numbers and sent back into battle. Tank brigades were rebuilt repeatedly. Artillery divisions were reconstituted after suffering total losses. The Soviet system treated military formations almost like interchangeable parts. Units could be destroyed and rebuilt almost indefinitely, as long as the replacement pipeline kept flowing. This was possible only because Soviet war production operated on such massive scale. The human cost was terrible, but from a purely military perspective, the system worked. Germany could never rebuild destroyed formations as quickly or as thoroughly. Naval warfare showed the same pattern. The US Navy entered the war with a battle fleet that was badly damaged at Pearl Harbor and inferior to Japan's in the Pacific. By 1944, the US Pacific Fleet was the most powerful naval force in history, with dozens of aircraft carriers, modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This transformation took less than 3 years, and was possible only because American shipyards were producing warships faster than combat could sink them. Japan, by contrast, began the war with a powerful fleet but could never replace losses. Japanese carrier fleet was effectively destroyed at Midway in 1942 and never fully rebuilt. American carriers sunk were replaced within months. Japanese carriers sunk were irreplaceable. The merchant marine showed similar patterns. The Allied merchant fleet, despite heavy losses to U-boats, grew throughout the war. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied merchant ships, totaling 7.8 million tons. Yet the Allied merchant fleet was larger at the end of 1942 than at the beginning, because new construction exceeded losses. In 1943, with U-boat losses declining and ship construction accelerating, the merchant fleet grew by millions of tons. By 1944, the Allies had far more shipping than they needed. Germany, meanwhile, lost most of its merchant fleet in the first years of the war, and could never rebuild it due to Allied naval superiority. Even small arms and ammunition tell the story. The United States produced 47 million rifles and carbines during the war, plus billions of rounds of ammunition. Germany produced about 13 million rifles. The Soviet Union produced 12 million rifles, plus captured and refurbished German weapons. Allied soldiers were never short of ammunition. They could call down massive artillery barrages and fire their weapons liberally. German soldiers, especially late in the war, were often rationed ammunition and told to make every shot count. American infantry battalions routinely expended more ammunition in a day than some German divisions had in their entire supply dumps. The atomic bomb, which ended the war against Japan, represented the ultimate expression of Allied industrial and scientific superiority. The Manhattan Project cost $2 billion, equivalent to about $30 billion today, and employed 130,000 people at its peak. It required building entire cities in Tennessee and Washington state to house workers. It consumed enormous amounts of electrical power at one point. The Oak Ridge facility used more electricity than many entire countries. Only the United States could have undertaken such a project while simultaneously fighting a two-front war. Germany had a nuclear program but never devoted the resources necessary to build a bomb. The gap in industrial capacity was simply too great. In the end, World War II was won in the factories and shipyards as much as on the battlefields. The Allies didn't just defeat Germany militarily, they overwhelmed it industrially. Every tank destroyed was replaced with 2. Every aircraft shot down was replaced with 3. Every ship sunk was replaced with 5. The production advantage was so overwhelming that by 1944, Germany's situation was hopeless regardless of tactics or strategy. German soldiers fought with skill and courage, but they were simply overwhelmed by enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The Wehrmacht was, in the words of one historian, trying to sink a rising tide with buckets. The final irony is that Germany understood the importance of industrial production. German military planners had studied World War I and knew that industrial capacity had been decisive. Hitler himself frequently discussed the need for armaments production. Yet Germany never fully mobilized its economy until it was too late, never achieved the production levels necessary to compete with the Allies, and made strategic decisions like the emphasis on wonder weapons that wasted scarce resources. The Allies, particularly the United States, understood that modern war required total mobilization of industrial capacity and acted accordingly. The result was a production miracle that enabled the replacement of losses at a rate Germany could never match. Today, military historians study World War II production as a case study in industrial warfare. The lessons remain relevant in an age of precision weapons and high technology. Wars are still won or lost based on logistics, supply chains, and the ability to replace losses. The country that can keep its forces supplied, equipped, and reinforced will usually prevail over an enemy that cannot, regardless of tactical superiority. World War II proved this principle on the largest scale in history. The Allies won because they could replace losses faster than Germany could count them, and because that replacement advantage translated into overwhelming force that no amount of German skill or courage could overcome. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.